Hello everybody, it's Walter, your favorite historian, educator, professor, and social studies extraordinaire, here today to give you a brief overview of the Freedmen's Bureau. For those who have never heard of the Bureau and have no idea what it was all about, or those who may have heard of it and nonetheless have no idea what it was all about, the Freedmen's Bureau was a federal agency established by the United States Congress in the closing days of the American Civil War with the purpose of helping the millions of recently freed African Americans in the South transition from a state of slavery to a state of freedom. Established in 1865, the Bureau would assist African Americans financially and otherwise in getting a foothold in the world. Remember, most of them had nothing to their names but the clothes on their backs. So during its existence, the Bureau would also help hundreds, if not thousands, of Southern whites who had been disestablished by the war to restore their livelihoods. Though it was never fully funded the way it should have been, given the amount of people that it had to help, it still provided a vital lifeline for millions who otherwise wouldn't have had anything to help them get on their feet or get back on their feet. In 1872, Congress officially terminated the existence of the Freedmen's Bureau, leaving much of its work unfinished and many blacks without the proper assistance that they needed to establish a foothold in the world. Nonetheless, its existence marked the entry of the federal government into the social welfare business for any segment of the American population. Yes, you heard me right. Before the Freedmen's Bureau, there was never in the history of the United States a federal social welfare program ever created designed to help any segment of the American population. Hard to imagine that today, but yes, this was once upon a time we were still a very make it your own way, pull it yourself up by the bootstraps type of country. So there wasn't any federal aid coming your way if you were struggling, all right? So, a little bit of background. As a result of the activities and documentation provided by the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission in 1863, Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill on March the 3rd, 1865. Signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln, it officially established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, aka the Freedmen's Bureau. Its purpose was to provide provisions, clothing, and fuel for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and their wives and children. The initial bill established the agency with a one-year lifespan and merged it with the U.S. Department of War, aka the War Department. As such, Congress provided no direct funding for the agency, and virtually all of its funding and staffing came from where? The War Department. For its entire existence, the Bureau was headed by Union Army General Oliver Otis Howard, for whom Howard University is named, by the way, who governed it with an iron fist in fulfilling its purposes. Over time, the Bureau would provide essential things, like I said, to the millions of freedmen in the South, such as education, employment, housing, food, medical care, legal representation, and licensing, just to name a few. When the Bureau came up for renewal in 1866, Congress, controlled by the Republican Party, gladly renewed its charter. As a Southerner from Tennessee and an open racist, President Andrew Johnson, however, would veto the bill on 4 grounds. First, he thought that the Freedmen's Bureau encroached too much upon states' rights. Second, he thought that it was an improper use of the military in peacetime. Third, it gave blacks, in his opinion, aid and assistance that poor whites had never received, even though you just heard me say that Southern whites benefited from the Bureau just as much as blacks, if not more than blacks in many places. And lastly, he thought it would inhibit blacks from becoming self-sufficient by rendering them dependent on public assistance. My. So with Congress controlled by the radical Republican Party, Johnson's veto was overridden and the Bureau continued to function. This was a short-lived victory, however, as by 1869, Democrats in Congress had reduced much of its funding, and thus a great deal of its staff had to be cut. The problem got worse with time, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, and many Northern Democrats began opposing the Bureau, charging that it would make blacks lazy and unwilling to work. Never mind that these people had spent their entire lives in slavery and had nothing and were, totally left with nothing to even work with, but they didn't care about any of that. So in 1872, Congress chose not to renew the Bureau's charter, and the agency ceased to exist. Its sole director, General Oliver Otis Howard, had previously been assigned to the West to deal with the crisis between Native Americans and white settlers. Interestingly enough, he was not even informed about the decision to close the Bureau altogether. So the structure. The Bureau initially had districts in all the former Confederate states, as well as the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Each of these districts was headed by an assistant commissioner. Its effectiveness varied greatly from district to district and from commissioner to commissioner, as you would expect. Again, throughout its existence, the Bureau was chronically underfunded and understaffed, reaching a total of just 900 agents at its peak. Pathetic. So, the duties. At its prime under General Howard, once again, the Bureau provided food, education, employment, housing, medical care, legal representation, judicial decisions, and licensing. As the South was virtually decimated as a result of the Civil War, between 1865 and 1869 alone, the Bureau distributed some 15 million rations of food to blacks and some 5 million to whites. They would build countless hospitals, provide crucial medical aid and training, negotiate labor contracts between slaves and ex-masters, settle labor disputes, as well as establish schools and provide numerous mechanisms for employment. Okay? The Bureau would also assist freedmen in legalizing their marriages, finding lost relatives, and assisting black veterans in receiving pensions, back pay, and enlistment bounties. With respect to education, the Bureau, like I said, established a significant number of schools for African American children and provided education for adults who were, as you would expect, largely illiterate. Additionally, they were responsible for the creation of several prominent HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, which still exist to this very day. It's an awesome thing. They are Atlanta University, which is now known as Clark Atlanta, in Atlanta, Georgia, established in 1865. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, established in 1866. Howard University in Washington, D.C., established in 1867. And Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia in 1868. There are more, but these are the most preeminent ones. So the legacy of the Bureau is quite clear. As, like I said, it marked, the federal government's entrance into the social welfare arena and was a form of repentance on the part of the U.S. government in helping to uplift a people whose enslavement it had protected since its creation. Because the Bureau existed, albeit with limited resources, African Americans were given a chance to have bootstraps to pull up. Many benefited a great deal, and though its time in existence was short, it served to put many blacks on a livable playing field as free and productive individuals. And that's something that bothers me about today's Republican Party, which has the mantra of pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make it your own way. Well, it's kind of hard to do that in many situations when you don't even have any boots to pull straps up on. All right, African Americans, after hundreds of years of enslavement, obviously had no bootstraps to work with, and they needed this type of assistance to get them on their feet. Black folks weren't lazy. They just needed a little help getting established. And it's amazing that, the whites of the day, not all of them, but certainly a tremendous portion of them, thought that these programs would make blacks lazy. Hardly the case. You can't call a people who have been in slavery for hundreds of years lazy, no matter how you feel about them. And the Freedmen's Bureau certainly helped to put them on a playing field where they were actually able to compete and be the true equals of whites if given the opportunity. So that concludes my video. I thank you for listening and hope you learned a thing or two from it. Subscribe to my channel. Keep on learning. Take care of yourself. Stay safe out there. And I will talk to you at the next video. Professor out.